this is, Laz, there are rare times in our lives, and maybe this is a silver lining of the pandemic and Zoom, when you and I and others that have come to this place in our lives and in our careers where we can just kind of breathe a little bit and share the joy of what we've been doing and the knowledge that we've been creating in our separate ways, and then in the sort of togetherness. And conferences feel very busy to me, and so this is pretty extraordinary. I just feel so filled with light and joy that something like the dancing biography that I wrote on Arturo Islas was interesting and important for you.
Yeah, the framing was so clear. I mean, it just, even the way you organized it, from the various sections to ancillary materials that you provided at the end, there was an intellectual and a pedagogical imperative in the way that you organized it, which I thought was not only elegant but really necessary, especially in dealing with his work. So thank you for that, and that framing helped. So, and sometimes when we do our acknowledgments, you can't include everybody, but I did ponder. Should I mention Fred and but that's what you were mentioning before about how wonderful it is to have an opportunity to engage with someone and let them know how important their work has been in your own formation in ways that aren't as possible or as probable in an academic conference or in a traditional setting. So this indeed is like one of the silver linings of the moment that we're living through, being fortunate enough to be healthy, alive, and be able to work from home, as so many haven't. So I'm so grateful for you for reaching out.
So we have our part 2, and we're gonna have a lot of fun talking a little bit more in depth about the archive and law, and I really want to get into especially the sort of the Latinx question and what that means. So welcome back, Laz. And I want to ask, let's just jump right in here. Brownness as something that seems to be kind of forefront in the media right now in all sorts of different ways, and even sometimes a little bit aggressive. I'll be honest, I think there was some aggressive, I felt, I'm not him, and of course, he's in many ways untouchable, and I mean, of course, Lin-Manuel, but the kind of colorism in the Heights, and the critique that was kind of, actually hurled at him, and his very graceful response, I thought about, look, I can do better and I'm learning. But I use that only as an example of how kind of brownness or Latinidad is really, there's a lot of pressure points kind of being put on that and what it means to belong. But then you even start kind of larger about belonging and unbelonging narratives of nation and the Latino question. Can you take us on this journey?
What a great way to start. In the Heights is so significant for so many different people on so many different grounds that in some respects, we're just fortunate to be able to be at a moment where we can exercise that type of critique, because the moment prior to that is we have no representation. So we're talking about representation, and now we're talking about gradations of brownness, whereas before we were talking about the sheer and absolute absence of brownness, save as it was understood, from the swarthy, complected, Middle Eastern sort of stereotypes that were on on TV and in film for so long. So it became really important for me to figure out how to provide a framing strategy for anybody that's interested for thinking through Latinidad and understanding Latinidad in relationship to the state, because most of the work that I was reading, the conferences that I was attending, Latinidad concerned fundamentally people's relationship to brownness or characters' relationship to brownness in plays and in media and what have you. But I wanted to see how brownness is an identity that the state refuses to release. And the state refuses to release it because it is interested in codifying difference in the nation's public sphere, in the national imaginary, as it were. And so I wanted to figure out how this absence that we were talking about during part one, which is, how is it that Latinx communities are seen as recent interlopers onto the national scene, when we know, I knew that, you know, the prehistory of people that today we consider Latinx antedates the creation of the United States and is coterminous, parallel with the creation of the United States. So part of that interest in the 19th century for me was seeing how the Mexican question, what is the country to do with Mexicans after the US-Mexico War in states like, as I mentioned before, California, Nevada, New Mexico, parts of Wyoming and Colorado, as well as Texas. So what is the country to do with that? And the answer became pretty clear. It was to class Mexicans as Blacks who spoke a different language. And that made the fundamental conundrum of the United States one between Black and white and nothing in between. So that dynamic was one that Mexicans and other Latin Americans in the US had to understand, cope with, and attempt to navigate and survive. And one of the most significant strategies was one of racial and class affiliation. And we had discussed previously Maria Amparo Ruiz de Burton and, you know, her representation of characters in The Squatter and the Don, for example, as, you know, blue-eyed and elegant and pensive, as gente de razón, that is, reasonable people, not the savages that were deprived of sentience or the ability to think or understand or be citizens in the res publica. So part of that dynamic was figuring out, if that's the case, and if that was the Latinx response to disenfranchisement in the 19th century, what were the other moments of possibility as well as failure, so that then we could present a roadmap, those of us who are thinking about this, for other scholars, other interested individuals to emerge and add to this longer narrative of participation and obfuscation and whitewashing. And one of the interesting things that emerges in the mid-20th century is a very significant Supreme Court case, Menendez versus Texas, that often gets overshadowed by Brown, which is another incredibly significant case. And the Nandis case was fascinating to me on several grounds. It was brought to the court by LULAC, the League of United Latin American Citizens. And that was very curious to me because part of the concientización, the coming to consciousness of Mexican Americans in realizing that they were continually being treated as second-class citizens by virtue of colorism, as it expressed itself in the United States, was after World War I and World War II. So Mexicans began to see that they were continually denied access to that category of race that they had been assigned, which was white, fundamentally, but in essence, not so much in practice. So the Hernandez case, brought on by LULAC, allowed then for a broader conversation for us to understand how the state configures Latino subjects. And what was interesting also about LULAC is, keep in mind, they didn't define the organization as League of United Mexican American Citizens. They defined the organization as the League of United Latin American Citizens, as opposed to Mexican American citizens. In other words, they were conscious of the fact that Mexicanness was a signifier of racial affiliation and not national identification or ancestry. So it was a strategic conceit so that somehow in that refracted mirror that is identity in the United States, that they would present then another version of that narrative that they had inherited about being Blacks who spoke a different language. So the case becomes really significant. It was because of LULAC that the court ultimately decided that people of Latin American ancestry in the United States, deserved 14th Amendment protections, which were only extended to Blacks after the Civil War, right? So those 14th Amendment protections meant that there was a recognition about the state's relationship to Latinos, people that today we would consider Latinos, and the way that they had been treated in the broader historical narrative of the United States. And that case, the other significant case, the Brown case, was also premised on another Mexican-American case from, I believe it was 1948. It was Menendez versus Westminster School District, when a Mexican-American father takes it to the court and says, you know, my daughter is not getting an education that is significant in any way because she's being treated as Black kids are. So there was a segregation argument. So that case then, for Thurgood Marshall in particular, became a way to understand how to move the conversation around stare decisis. That is the legal principle that law is based on previous precedent, and previous precedent should hold. So that principle of stare decisis then allowed the court to then say it is clear that Mexicans have been treated differently. And this case then codifies the type of protections that people of Latin American ancestry should receive in the United States. And that was significant to me because it was the first time in the national narrative that it was necessary to do so. And when we look at the broader trajectory of when these identities butt up against the state and become codified by the state, it isn't until after the Civil Rights Act of 1964 that we had a decision by, out of all possible offices, the Office of Management and Budget. And this was in 1976, a law that was passed by Congress, and it was called Public Law 94-311. Again, that's from the 94th Congress, where the law mandated the analysis and collection of data for Americans of, they said, Spanish origin or descent, and described this group of Americans, that is what today we're calling Latinos, as individuals who could trace their origins from Mexico, Puerto Rico, Cuba, Central America, and South America. And it said other Spanish-speaking countries. Now, the intent was then to figure out how Mexican Americans, Puerto Ricans, Cubans, again, what we're calling today Latinos, had been treated as second-class citizens. And one of the quotes from it said, from that law passed by the 94th Congress, was an understanding that a large number of Americans, Latin American descent, suffered racial, social, economic, and political discrimination, and were denied basic opportunities that they deserved as American citizens. So that law also enabled an understanding, at least for those of us who are interested in identity negotiations as it relates to political enfranchisement, liberties, the fortification of democratic practice, to understand how we must hold the state accountable for the few moments that it enacts a relationship to us, to Latinos, and those who are interested in fortifying democratic practice, and to understand how we must hold the state accountable and why. And beyond that, why it was necessary for these protections to be extended to begin with. So this allows us then to have a broader conversation about the finer nuances, but in my estimation, only after we have the basic understanding of how Latino-ness is ultimately a relationship to the state, much the same way that Native Americanness is a relationship to the state, the same way that Asian Americanness is a relationship to the state, the same way that Blackness or African Americanness is a relationship to the state. And I always tell students, whenever they fill out an application and they're asked to identify racially, and I do this oftentimes because students get frustrated, and then the experiences they share in the classroom are, well, I'm really mixed race and there's no category, so I'm going to leave the category open. And I say to them, part of the reason that these categories, these identity fictions are central to the US is that they provide access to resources and opportunities. So for one, to say, no, I'm just not going to bother. Imagine then it comes from a good place because it's a demand to recognize the multitudes, the various Latinx identities and more that adhere into a person, into one's individual identity. But one's individual identity is one's identification. And identity, as anthropologists often refer to it, is a relationship to the state. Identification is how we identify. You know, I might have identified as goth when I was in college. You know, some kids might have identified as preppy, but the state isn't interested in, you know, whether you identify as preppy or not, but it is interested in correcting social and historical impasses that have made it necessary for us to think through the importance of law, the state, and the body of the other. So the law won't release us. You know, it's inherent to the narrative, and whether we like it or not, understanding that is a point of departure for then going into the larger and more important questions that deal with identification. That is colorism, questions like in the Heights and Lynn Miranda, and what it means to have the possibility to represent an other, and what are the ethical considerations. Those to me are really important questions, but we need to build those questions on top of a foundation that allows us to identify those historical moments that the state has either delimited or enfranchised these identities. Think of laws in Arizona, anti-ethnic studies curriculum, all those instances where laws are used against Latinx communities, yet we have little consciousness of how there are laws that can allow us to have a better conversation, less informed by feelings, although feelings are incredibly important, but by facts, and how from these facts then we can begin to affectively render ourselves visible in ways that are meaningful to us and not as the state might define us. So that's part of why Sotomayor was so fascinating to me, and why law is something that to me just became an opportunity to think through how we might begin to create a different narrative about the largest majority minority in the United States at over 60 million strong. And for this case, in this particular case, you know, I want to remind you know, your students, and I want to remind everybody who might be listening to our podcast, that Sonia Sotomayor was the first to use undocumented in the court's record. The legal standing, the word used to identify the undocumented was simply illegal. And she made it a point in a case called Mohawk Industries from 2010. It was the first case that she contributed to significantly. And she instantiates in the record, in the historical record of the court in the United States, that no human being is illegal. You know, the salvo of activists that we have been saying for so long. And that then allows for a different way to conceive of the ethnic and racialized other that doesn't lump an act or an action with their ontological identity. If so-and-so is an illegal, their entire ontological status as a human being is. So this is where language, symbolic power, becomes so central to the important work that you've always been doing in understanding the importance of literature as a way to provide us with other ways of thinking that promote freedoms, right? And in that wonderful essay that you wrote from 2019 about the emergence of, you know, this plethora of Latinx texts that are all of a sudden permeating the public sphere, and all of a sudden we have what we didn't have before, which is publishing houses actually being interested in moving this conversation forward, at least in ways that had been difficult to do so before. But you, Fred, you've always stressed the importance to you of certainly the theoretical, but how the theoretical can't be primary in the experience that one brings to a literary text. And I'd really be interested in understanding or having you share more about that, because some of those same tensions, I think generationally, were probably from, went to graduate school at similar times. The theory heads were everything at the exclusion of the artistic artifact. And you write beautifully about why it matters. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about why it matters, and why literature matters, and why representation matters.
Yeah, and thanks, Laz, for asking that really kind of bedrock question that follows from your very bedrock kind of reasoning and work with law, state, and the body of other. Yeah, so I was, as you were talking, I was thinking, what does it mean for laws to systematically exclude, and then once laws are passed that desegregate education systems, at least on the surface, continue to uphold the push out lockout system that we see today. And I'm mentioning this because, of course, the material consequences of that is, generations of us and our communities and our kids not having access to the full spectrum of creative and thinking and even feeling tools to be able to choose to create comic books or literature or film, the documentary type of things that you're doing. And so going back, you mentioned, these important rulings in the 70s and earlier, like almost a miracle that we have writers appearing, in the 50s. Almost a miracle that we have writers appearing, even in the mid 70s, given that the very kind of bedrock of US law and policy has been so dead set against that possibility, right, of us finding our way to those places. So yeah, I think the marriage of these is so important, because yet again, in my approach to literature, and the reason why, as I talk about people like Barbara Christian, the late Barbara Christian, and Alfred Arteaga were so significant to me, was we never had, at least I don't feel like it, with the theory heads at Berkeley, we never had, with our authors and our literatures, the opportunity to really kind of relish in the circumstances of their creating. And so, yeah, that's maybe a long way around kind of answering, but yeah, so for me, it's always been that kind of tripartite approach where really try to understand the situatedness of the creative act in certainly in ways that you deep dive with the law, but I try to give sort of material context to the time and the place. And even in some instances, I'm thinking about authors like, I don't know, Acosta, Oscar Acosta, who, gosh, in the early 70s, in many ways, it's like he was anticipating a Latino readership to come in his writing, but that wasn't there at the time of the writing. And those kinds of things are really fascinating for me, Laz.
It's I'm reminded in the way that you were describing this, that wonderful memoir essay by Gloria Ansaldúa, How to Tame a Wild Tongue, where the moment of her discovery of John Recchi, where her head blows off, and she says, and to imagine that a Mexican American was writing about sexuality at this particular moment, it was something that allowed her then to imagine herself as a creative agent rather than a passive recipient of historical narratives and cultural narratives. And in that very same essay, she mentions how, while she's excited to read Westerns that she finds in the pharmacy, that her dad buys for her, Mexicans were represented as something that she didn't even recognize. So it isn't until Recchi that all of a sudden she has this awakening and sees herself as an agent and a creative force. And then she begins to, tell this wonderful story about how when she's teaching English in an English class in high school, she has to sneak in Chicano and Chicana writers because the curriculum wouldn't allow it. And so it's really touching to hear you share about the importance of the act of creation and imagining future readers, because in a way, and this is certainly something that I've found, students, when they read somebody like Ansaldúa, they have this moment where they just don't let go of the attachment to an identification. You could be cisgendered, Latinx students or a white student reading this. They find something that speaks to them and gives texture and narrative form to an exclusion that they felt. And no matter, it's funny. I used to start with, you won't be surprised, starting with Mexico-U.S. history in many of my Latinx courses, just to give a frame. And then I realized, no, starting with a text like How to Tame a Wild Tongue or La Prieta, for example, allows then for a type of identification that I just don't see as quickly and as earnestly in my pedagogical practice than if I were to start with a theoretical text. So I guess I'm saying and mirroring in some respects how, yes, the theoretical is incredibly important. It allows us to frame questions with more nuance than we're used to, but you have to have the practice of reading and identification with the text that is so incredibly liberating. In other words, we have a canon that wasn't able to recognize what today we're calling Latinx literature. And how wonderful, as you share in that essay, and I need to look up the essay so that others can find it. I think it's putting a finger to the vibrant beat of Latinx literary studies today. And it's you write for it in Latinx spaces. So, and in fact, it's going to be an essay that I'm going to include next semester in my courses, because it explains this moment of sheer joy at finding oneself reflected in the social mirror before you. And Ansaldúa is one, and so many of the writers that you've worked on are doing precisely that. Acosta, you mentioned, certainly Arturo Islas to varying degrees. But what are some of the other writers that are allowing you to think in ways that regenerate and allow you yourself, as a student of literature as well, not just a scholar, to reimagine the world in ways that bring us closer to personal and perhaps even collective freedoms?
Yeah, as you know, I find myself, and have been for years now, gravitating more and more and more and more toward comic books. And there is something extraordinary happening with our creatives, our Latinx creatives, and that particular storytelling form. And I just, sometimes it's the collaboration that creates this incredible vitality in our immersion and our identification, and in it kind of waking us to new ways of seeing and understanding and even behaving. But let me give you an example. So Alex Sanchez, who has been for forever a YA, queer YA Latinx author, was tapped by DC to do one of their books for their YA, I think it's DC Inks. And he collaborated with an illustrator, French-Canadian queer illustrator, Jules Moreau, and they did the Aqualad graphic novel, You Brought Me the Ocean. And I'm telling you, this is like, I rubber band back to this constantly. It is set in Truth and Consequences, New Mexico, which has been on the news lately because of the SpaceX race.
Yes.
But it is extraordinary, Laz. If you haven't read it, you got to get your hands on it. It's something that, you know, I will be teaching from here to eternity. And I feel like this is an instance where the mainstream publishing industry is finally, whether it's for dollars or what, has finally clued into the fact that our stories and the nuances and complexities of our identities that have been shaped in and through the material realities as reconstructed through comics can and does just, like, you know, open us to all different new ways of experiencing things. And I really do think it's the marriage of the visual with the textual here that makes this an extraordinary experience. So that's a really great example. But there's still, you know, folks like Salvador Plasencia and others that, you know, or Giannina Braschi, who still kind of live on their own because they're pushing the envelope in a different way, that the kind of mainstream education system and even publishing industry doesn't know how to handle with us. So they're still okay with those recognizable identity kind of stories, but when it comes to metafiction and, you know, other playful ways that we can shape our experience and our stories, we're still writing for an audience to come.
Fascinating, really fascinating. I am definitely picking up Alex Sanchez's work.
Can I ask you while we're on this, because I'm going to skip a couple slides forward, if just really quickly. Did you feel like when you put this anthology together and published in 2011, Ambientes, that, kind of getting back to your question, like, could this have, in other words, I guess my question is, could this have happened earlier historically, or did we need to come to this place to be able to allow for this kind of creative volume to exist in the world?
You know, that text, Ambientes, New Queer Latino Writing, was the result of an absolute fixation I had about bringing together what had been, up to that point, compartmentalized. So you had anthologies of Chicano and Chicana writers that were queer. You had collections about, you know, Caribbean writers that were, but nobody was talking about the interplay between East Coast, West Coast, and the middle of the country, and how those writers were producing incredible works that really weren't receiving much of an audience. So when the project starts, in other words, by the time the project is published, some of the authors begin to take off, and others were already established authors. Like, you know, just think of Achi Ovejas and her contribution to the volume. And I'm also thinking of Miriam Gerba, whose work I had followed in various blogs, and her writing is sharp, powerful, incisive, and real. There's a realness to her work and her collection. So, now, Miriam's, her career has taken off, but and part of the reason why I asked her to submit material was I was reading her blog and I just saw this as incredible writing that wasn't in the classroom, that wasn't at, your local bookstore. So that sort of willingness to create an archive, if you will, some great text, short stories for the most part, some memoristically so, and they bend genres. And I had had a conversation with one of my favorite writers. Talk about identification. Felice Picano is one of the founders, my co-author for that collection, is one of the founders of the Violet Quill, which is the group of 5 male writers in New York City who came together to forge what today we understand as gay literature. I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that, because no publishing house was publishing anything related to that, with limited exceptions. Think of John Recchi and Grove Press. Grove Press being as edgy as it was, less so today, but still important nonetheless. So what was important to me is, in having this conversation with Felice, is what can I do if I want to bring together an archive, curate a series of writers of Latin American ancestry in the United States who identify as queer in whatever way, and how to go about it. Our conversations led to the collaboration. He's a phenomenal reader and writer. And I had found him as a kid because I thought, in reading some of his work, that he was Latinx. Felice Picano. That sounded to me like, the guy was a Latinx writer. Well, he happens to be Italian American, but it was that affinity that drew me to the text, and also the recognition that his work was describing imaginary worlds that, as a little brown kid, and I started writing. I mean, I've been reading forever, but even at 10, I was going to the library and picking this stuff up. The first job that I applied to was at the public library so that I could have access to all this books. And I would stay after my shift in the back in the stacks, even in the middle of summer, just reading all this material. And so we ended up becoming friends and put the project together. And we did so because at that moment, there really wasn't a pan-queer Latinx collection of text that could serve pedagogical purposes, either in the classroom or simply because a reader might want to pick it up and go, wow, this is phenomenal. And I know that I've touched many readers insofar as I still to this day, they find me on Gmail or whatever through my website, and they'll just send me a note about how important it was for them to read this or that story in this collection. So it included amazing authors like Elias Miguel Munoz, Achi Ovejas, Susana Chavez Silverman, Miriam Gerba, so many. And that is really one of, what I think is one of my signal contributions to Latinx reading, writing, and queer studies. Yet, as we know, the Academy doesn't value an edited collection like they do the scholarly monograph, right? So, but that's the first thing that I did after I got tenure at Bryn Mawr. I wanted to do something that would fill this thirst that I had as a kid, and that even up to, as a grown ass adult, still not finding a go-to that might model then what other future editors, readers, writers might envision. So it's like one of my pride points. And I think to this day, I go back to that text for what it taught me about a true commitment. I mean, that second monograph, single author monograph could come out a lot earlier, but no, this was important to do. and just knowing that people on occasion still send me notes is just incredibly rewarding. So talk about writing for the future. I in a sense, I was trying to collate and bring together wonderful writing that would have a projection toward the future. And now, as you mentioned in your essay about putting a finger to the vibrant beat of Latinx literary studies, it's possible largely because other people, were doing the same thing. But now we know about it in ways that we wouldn't have. So, I just imagine a future 10-year-old, perhaps at a library, perhaps, on their Kindle or on their phone, reading what was very hard to find at the moment that I came to concientización, this recognition that, I'm not the, the cisgendered, kid that I needed role models, man. If I didn't have these role models, I would have absolutely ended up in a place of abjection. And literature saved the day for me, and I can imagine it saving the day for others. But it's hard today, and I want to go back, if I may, to an observation that you made about the importance in reference to Alex Sanchez, when you were talking about how the combination of the visual and the textual is impactful. And I wanted to ask, do you think that part of the impact is that today's readership is so used to short form narrative fiction and even microfictions, if that you need the visual to sort of bring in other elements? And if you could talk about short attention spans, how the visual interacts with the written text, because it's so much of what you do in your work on Latinx comics, and even in this presentation, these wonderful graphics that you've included. Tell me more about that.
Yeah, that's great. Great question, Laz. So yeah, for sure. I mean, I'm sure you're like me, even though kind of the presence of the digital, and especially as a kind of creative shaping device in my classroom, is important. Film, comic books, web comics, all of that stuff. Unless we're actually focused on that as a kind of primary textual moment of analysis, all the phones go away in my classroom because they are glued to the phones, and the phones, are, even if you scroll through social media, as you and I do, as most people do, it's the visuals that stop us, and we take pause. And the textual is definitely taking more of a subordinate within that space. So you can imagine with kids that have been reared on it, then yes. So yes, for sure. Now, comics, the dominant shaping device of comics in terms of storytelling, as you know, is the visual. And so the challenge for the creators in collaboration or as single entities is to not just give shape to story through visual, and of course, using the textual as a way to nuance and bring tension into those spaces. The challenge is to slow us down. And it's what I've called elsewhere in my work, the ethno-racial pause. And where are those moments, those carefully shaped moments in the story where we're deliberately asked to take that pause, and where the visuals do the work of asking us to take pause and stitch into and complicate kind of identification processes, and where we begin to kind of reshape schemas about others and ourselves. So I think, yes, our students and even me so used to, yes, we stop at the visual, and usually that's where I deep dive. But where is it in a story? How can it be used in a story where the dominant is the visual? that the shaping device can really ask us to breathe into the story. So yeah, I mean, that's where I think the power, there are some comics that are like popcorn movies. You read them and they're fun, but you don't go back to them. And then there are some, like, you know, You Brought Me the Ocean and many others, where you just like can't wait to get back to them. So that's, I guess, a long way around answering, you know, or how I would answer that question of the significance of the visuals as shaping device today, and how it kind of, you know, the task or the challenge, as you know, even teaching film, is to now, once we've kind of taken pause and we're breathing into this visual moment space in the story, how then we can enrich that experience by providing the students with a vocabulary to kind of understand all of the different elements that make up that visual moment.
Awesome. There's a noise that was happening. I don't know if it's on your end or.
Let's see.
Stop now. So.
Okay, good. I think we're still good. We're still recording. So, but you know, while we're in the classroom, I'm going to jump back. Is there a trade? I mean, this whole thing is about pedagogy. So beautiful, as you've so beautifully kind of and organically shaped our conversation. But is there a like Lima, like trademark kind of teaching method or approach that, you know, you bring to your classrooms consistently?
Wow. How to funnel enthusiasm in a way that's intelligible to students has been one of the hardest things to do. And I describe myself, at least to friends, as a learned extrovert. And when we're in the classroom, we have to be an extrovert. And part of the training in literature is understanding that whatever you present has to have a cogent beginning, middle, and an end. And organizing the classroom as a space that's dialogic, but also allows students the opportunity to breathe, is really central to that. So there's no course that I've ever taught that hasn't included an electronic digital component, whether it's digital storytelling. In other words, move them from the experience of passive delivery to active creation of knowledge, where students then become co-creators of knowledge with you once they have a basis, right? And that begins quite simply with how they might feel about a particular text or a particular segment of a text that we are analyzing, and then move from feelings to organizing those feelings in a way that allows them to see the text conversation with literary and cultural history, so that no text in and of itself is, you know, emerges sui generis, right? I mean, all texts are a response to something, and then getting them to move from I feel this is great, or, you know, I feel this is boring, to understand what the engagement might be. So, you know, one of the favorite essays for me to often teach is Arturo Schoenberg's essay on this wonderful Puerto Rican painter, Jose Campeche. And part of Schoenberg's interest in Campeche's work is calling him a Puerto Rican painter even before Puerto Rico, you know, could be codified as an independent nation state. I mean, it's still under the tutelage of the United States. So Schoenberg was interested in creating Black artistic antecedents so that in his present, that archive could serve the function of allowing others to look back and see an anchoring in a tradition that would have remained whitewashed and inexistent were it not for this insistence on looking at what historians call ethnic particularisms, you know, those things that make ethnic communities particular. He was interested in understanding what makes majoritarian communities assume that anything that is particular is antithetical to the norm. And I'm reminded oftentimes of Toni Morrison and this interview that she had many moons ago with Jane Waite, who's a New Zealand journalist. And the journalist asked Toni Morrison, will you ever include white writers in your fictions? Will you ever leave that safe space of Black culture and identity? And Toni Morrison, without skipping a beat in the elegance and brilliance that is her mind, and calmly says, I don't think you realize what a deeply racist question that is, because you would never ask a white author when they're going to include more Black writers in their narrative. So by turning that around, we begin to see that those normative structures, what we in literary studies call canonicity. This is a canonical text. It's important of a particular period. It exemplifies the best of writing. Her writing was not only writing against oblivion, but also rewriting that history. And it happens at such an opportune moment. I mean, from The Bluest Eye onward in her trajectory, and also as an editor for a major publisher in the United States, where she was able to bring to the fore other writers. It's stunning to me how she was also writing for the future, but also culling the past in ways that allowed us to see that whitewashing and how it functioned in our moment. So, you have Beloved and the importance of the story of Margaret Garner, a slave woman who would rather kill her child than subject them to the brutality of slavery, which included rape, beatings, unimaginable abuse. Only the aesthetic would allow for that depth, whereas the historical would have been too concerned with facts, numbers, and figures. And it is in that generative moment where she pulls you in that we begin to ask questions, as I often say, with more nuance than we're used to. But Fred, it's also important to recognize that the emergence of African-American lit in the academy coincides precisely at a moment where anti-affirmative action initiatives are emerging. So for the first time, for our generation at least, in the classroom, we have more text talking about Black and brown people and Asian Americans than we have Black and brown people. So think of, I think it was California Proposition 108, where you couldn't use race, and all of a sudden the numbers of brown students and Black students dips precipitously in the 80s. So literature was meant to do the work of inclusion to a largely white student audience. But it is that generation of students who all of a sudden said, wait, where is the absence of the very people? Where's the material bodies of the very people these texts are conjuring? Why aren't they here? And then you begin another version and instantiation of the civil rights movement, where representation becomes so central. And that representation and the question of representation is leading us to our moment. We began our discussion with Lin Miranda and In the Heights, and the inclusion of actors who aren't quite representative of the Heights and the Dominicans and the Dominican American community that lives there. So representation and literature certainly go hand in hand, but they allow us to do things with the world that the historical would not allow. And because of those identificatory practices, that bringing in and being able to frame a narrative in a way that allows us to open up the world to our own misconceptions about the world. So my pedagogical practice is fundamentally provide the frames to anchor them in the historical, but then allow them the freedom, much the way that you described in that wonderful essay, allow them the freedom then to move in a direction that allows them to be creators rather than passive recipients. So in my literature classes, one of our assignments is always a memoir. And this past year, they wrote, and I begin with short, I use a thing called Padlet, which allows students to post short narratives and others to read them and have responses to them. And the question was about COVID and how COVID had transformed their life. What they wrote was absolutely beautiful. We put it together in a PDF, and it's a collection of memoir pieces from my second to last seminar in Latinx literature. So moving them from analysis to the actual doing is central to this, and it's also central to my pedagogical practice. And but there's still so much that I can improve on, and that's why I'm fascinated by how you're bringing in students into their own processes of concientización by virtue of using a visual vocabulary and a textual, text-driven imperative that allows them then to integrate those that might then allow for that deeper pause, that slow, immersive pause that allows us then to breathe intellectually in ways that they might not be used to with the snippets, the Twitter sphere snippets, right? So this is why, and I love comics. I went into reading because of comics as I was a kid. My favorite was the Green Lantern. And then it was Aquaman, and I had reasons for that, right? But so there was also identification and desire for the image, but also desiring what the words meant. And I remember telling my third grade teacher when asked what I was reading. So I had like a geography textbook, and in between it, I had a comics. And it was my English. I was Spanish dominant. So I said to her, I am reading about aliens. And she goes, aliens? You mean aliens? I'm like, oh, that's how you pronounce it. So that discovery, and she happened to be a good teacher and didn't chastise me. She was just happy that I was reading. And also I was doing the homework because I was, one of those kids. But it is that identification that allows us then to open up our worlds in ways that we become agents rather than passive recipients of knowledge. What's your signature pedagogical practice?
You're the first person to ask me in these podcasts. Mine. So pretty typically, I like. So this is my confessional moment. I will say I love my graduate students, but my graduate students find me by way of my work and not the classroom. And what I mean by that is I actually elect to teach all my classes as undergraduate classes. And I just find that that's the place where I can make the biggest change. And so I haven't actually taught a graduate seminar in over a decade. Wow. And so that's a preface to, yes, the undergraduates, and the first thing I do is I come in with a question. It could be a film and comics course, a Latinx pop culture course, any of the above, intro to comic studies. And it's a question I had as I was rereading, in most cases, the material for the lecture, about something really big, like walk in and ask the students what constitutes the self, something like that, right? And then I give them 5 minutes to turn to the partner on either side of them, and to deliberate and talk about this big question. And, it could be, something generated from watching Thor Ragnarok or something, right? And then I listen carefully and kind of see where we can go with their responses, and then weave it into the material at hand. So if there is a trademark, it's that I always begin with the big question. So thanks for asking. it's the pause at the beginning of the narrative for the day, or the story for the day.
Yeah.
I want to, while we're talking about beginning, middles, ends, pauses, the presencing of the absent, and the kind of bringing one into this place of being agent and creative force. Let me hear a little bit about this work you've been doing with Carolyn and independently, documenting voices.
Yeah, I'm going to have to borrow your big question pedagogical move, because I think it could be really, really useful for lots of different reasons that I'd love to talk more to you about. But thank you about the question and my work with Carolyn Brown, who's a phenomenal filmmaker. And anybody can look her up online and see all the films that she's done. I had an intellectual and also almost artistic craving to produce something of import and significance, at least in my mind, that could reach audiences in ways that the traditional monograph would not. And we talked a little bit about Ambientes, so that was also the edited collection I did with Felice Picano, and that was also part of it. But not knowing anything about film production, or directing, or story making, or doing the storyboard, which are things that I eventually self-taught myself, was an opportunity that I just could not let go of. So, for example, when I made my move from Bryn Mawr to the University of Richmond, I had the opportunity to not worry about producing work that was strictly scholarly, but that was, at least for me, going to make me a better thinker and pose interpretive problems differently than I had done with the traditional monograph or essay article or book chapter or what have you. So I had met a student, Ruby, who is just incredible for lots of different reasons. And I felt that her story was compelling in ways that might move minds and hearts, and also allow other students who are undocumented to think about their own struggles and how someone who's exemplary, Ruby, managed those struggles. And I wanted to do this in the form of a short film. So I started applying for grants and became really adept at grant writing. As you can imagine, a film is very expensive to make. You have to have a crew. It isn't just your camera, although that could be creative. But I tried Final Cut Pro, and it was too glitchy for what I wanted to do. So then, after getting sabbatical, had applied for sabbatical after a couple of years at Richmond. And I got some funding, initial seed funding for a documentary project about DACA. I applied to the Center for Latin American Latino Studies at American University as a fellow because I knew that Carolyn Brown was there. She was in the film and media department. And that if I built a relationship with her and told her about the project, that maybe we could have something in common. And, not inconsequentially, that I had a little bit of money to bring to the table. She was working on a project about Latina women throughout the West and Southwest. And it coincided with my interest in Ruby's story. We hit it off. We're very different, yet we just worked together wonderfully. And we eventually, I introduced her to Ruby, and then just began filming. We started filming in North Carolina, where she's from and where her family now resides. And we started filming also in Colorado, where another potential documentary case study would have emerged, and that's also another project that I'm working on. So part of what was impressive to me about Ruby's story is not just resilience. All students who are undocumented are resilient in ways that we could never imagine, but how she really modeled a practice and a way of being in the world that just exuded calm, intelligence, earnestness, and kept applying for grants and eventually put the film together. And we had two versions. We had one for theatrical release, and we got in touch with ETA, which is like a PBS broadcaster, and then it was eventually picked up by PBS, and it's already aired in major markets. And part of the challenge, as anybody who's been producing during COVID, is we had appearances slated and scheduled for various universities, film festivals, and that all just went to naught. But we've had, fortunately, a series of Zoom events where we've had an opportunity to present the film above and beyond the channel, and whatever local channel may or may not have picked it up. So again, part of the purpose was, if these intellectual projects called freedom, liberation, imagination are important to me and are constitutive of who I am, what can I do within my power to also share that and allow others to imagine their own, whether it's petite freedoms in their day-to-day practice, how they survived yet, another microaggression, and then thinking through how they or one might survive even greater confrontations with the identity machine and the state. So that was the impetus, and I'm still working with Carrie on another project, and of course, it's hard to do filming. And what people don't know, and I didn't know, is beyond the storyboard, which is how you organize the narrative of the film and how you let a character tell the story, was also, you basically have, for every hour of film that you have, you might be able to use a minute.
Mm-hmm.
And so we're talking about that sabbatical year and beyond, every opportunity that I had during the summer for filming, for redoing interviews. And I'm happy to share a version of the documentary with you. As long as it's not the PBS version, we can share the doc. So
yeah, actually what we need to do is see if we can, if I can build that into my course this fall and have you and Carrie join us to talk about it. I would love that. Gosh, it is so, we're, in many ways, you and I, our journeys have been, we've talked about this briefly before. It could have been very different, but fortunately, our journeys have brought us to a place where we can kind of, go into these places. I just love what you're doing, Laz. As we start to wind this down, I wanted to ask you, speaking of finger on the pulse, where you see the heartbeat in Latinx critical studies today?
I largely consider myself interdisciplinary, and oftentimes people tout that word in ways that are antithetical to the way that I refer to it. So interdisciplinarity is something that would allow us to pose interpretive problems in ways that ordinarily wouldn't be able to. So what convinces a literary critic need not convince a sociologist or a political scientist, but by virtue of the artifact itself, the literary artifact, you may not be able to measure impact, those data points that quantitative analysis requires. So I think anything that brings us back to an understanding of the literary as a space free of constraints is work that that I read and follow. Like many, just imagine for our generation, we had very few scholars to envision or base our careers on. I mean, in the West, it was a little bit different. The Chicanx tradition was already more established. But those of us on the East Coast, where we didn't even have or even knew that there was such a thing called Latinx literature, what we call Latinx literature today. So those people who, and in fact, we overlap in the essay that I mentioned that you wrote, Karen Christian's Show and Tell, Identity and Performance in U.S. Latino Fiction, just gave me the vocabulary to move away from ethnic essentialisms and see how reading practices are more complicated than ethnic frames would allow. And, you know, whether it's Plasencia, which you also mentioned, or so many others, Cecile Pineda, for example, who was, you know, what we call a Latinx writer, but her narratives weren't necessarily Latinx in nature. So what constitutes Latinx? Those are the types of interventions that I'm interested in. And a lot of it is coming from younger scholars who are building on, just like we have, the tradition of others. And I thought a little bit about what names I would share with you, but if I do, I know that I'm going to leave so many others out there that I'm just going to tip my hat in the direction of interdisciplinary work in Latinx studies that conceives of the literary broadly, and we know who they are. And maybe we should mention them, but I'd like to ask you, where do you see the pulse of Latinx literary studies? Let's see if you name names.
Well, I name names, I think, in that piece. But yeah, no, I think you're right. It's actually maybe what you're saying, which is kind of putting some shape to a moment or a movement even that's happening today, that we're seeing happen today. That's kind of the result of a lot of work that has come before. But what I love is that my sense is there's a certain ease and comfort with our neighbors, with our folks that might not be following the same critical approach, interdisciplinary approach and pathway. They might not be asking the same questions, but it's okay. And we celebrate that. And I feel like maybe I'm reading this wrong, but certainly my experience in graduate school and then as an in my early stages as a professor, I felt like there was a lot of tension and there was a lot of, no, you're doing it wrong, I'm doing it right.
Yeah.
And I feel like we might be finally at a moment in our critical studies where we are all generating knowledge and there's a seriousness about it, but that finally we're all able to come out into the street and play together.
What a great way of describing it, yeah. And less adversarial and more collaborative, which is the function of narrative today, whether it's digital or what have you. It's fundamentally a collaborative practice. I've really enjoyed this, and I'm going to send your way links to the film, and I could have this conversation over beer or wine, or or even just coffee, cafecito, over and over again. So thank you for the opportunity to be you're just such a great interlocutor, and so thrilled to finally have connected, even though we've known of each other for a while. Now it's real, man.
It is real. Thank you, Laz, so much.